Thank you, David, for the introduction and the opportunity to be here. My name is Anthony Pappas. I'm the owner of Heritage Habitat and Forestry, a consulting forestry company that does a variety of services. One in particular is Forest Carbon Consulting, which I'm going to talk to you today about. We're going to talk about some of the carbon programs that are out there. And here we go, it'll be on the next slide. Give us an idea of a forester consultant sort of relationship and how to work through these different programs, see if they're a good fit for you, and talk about some of the stipulations. Personal background, I'll be brief on this. Graduated from WVU, worked for private consultant for a while, then worked for Arkansas Game and Fish Commission out there. Started my company, Heritage Habitat and Forestry, about 2 years ago, based here in Central Ohio. Do work statewide, PA, West Virginia. Focused on sustainable comprehensive forest management and the forest carbon consulting service that we're going to talk about today. So give us a brief outline. I want to provide a general overview of the several programs available to landowners. And there's other non-forest carbon programs, such as Working Trees, which is a silvopasture program, part of what's called afforestation, reforestation, that I'll briefly discuss on the slide. Like I said, this will be from the perspective of consultant landowner. So I'm not going to take it into as much detail as Charles did, because that was an excellent primer and a lot of information on how this process works. This will be more of a discussion on my conversations with landowners about the different programs and kind of my experience doing, close to 100 of these now in PA and West Virginia, since Ohio doesn't have family forest carbon program yet, but there is some Ohio work through NCX and Forest Carbon Works that I've been a part of as well. And if you like kind of Charles' technical discussion, if you want a lot more of that, there is a great episode. I believe he was on this as well. The West Virginia Woodland Stewards Group had a carbon symposium in 2021, and I can get you a link to that if you would like to really dive into all this. So, as kind of already stated in the beginning, I'm not going to beat a dead horse here, but there's several private companies purchasing what are essentially carbon rights. Just like you have timber rights, mineral rights, you now have carbon rights. In a nutshell, you're agreeing to several different things, and not all of these are simultaneous. It just depends on the company that you go with. Generally, you're contracting to grow your trees longer and larger over a specified contract length. Think of Tristan's conversation about growing mature forests. That's that. You could defer timber harvests for X number of years. That is how Natural Capital Exchange, NCX, sets up their program. You could get paid to plant trees in a working pasture land. That's how Working Trees operates their program, which I'll touch on briefly. Most of the programs, again, this varies depending upon which company you go with, because they're all a little bit different. Most of them allow firewood removals, invasive species control, herbicide application, that sort of thing on, multiflora rows, have you, tree of heaven, and then limited timber harvests in accordance with program requirements. Tristan touched on those for Family Forest Carbon Program. Forest Carbon Works has some restrictions, and then NCX is the way that they operate. You could do a full-blown harvest. You would just reduce the number of credits that you sell, which we'll discuss that on some future slides. So you still maintain your timber rights. You're not selling timber rights, and you must be legally allowed to harvest timber. So even if you have an easement on the property, as long as that easement grants you the ability to harvest timber as you see fit on that property, you're going to qualify. And again, that's a general statement. But if, say, for instance, you've signed an agreement with easement company A, and in their contract they say landowner B is not allowed to harvest any timber on this property for X number of years. Well, that's going to limit your qualification to some of these programs. And then here's my little sales pitch while I'm giving this presentation, is that we offer Forest Carbon Consulting. This is sort of a table of some of what we look at when I've got a landowner that's interested in enrolling in a program. We run them through the gambit, get them an assessment, do a property visit, and then I compile. Right now, I think I'm up, close to 100-ish landowners into this giant spreadsheet I have, and I'm able to spit out, some of these averages that landowners are getting paid and compare, your offer to some of the regional averages, because a lot of these numbers might not mean anything to a landowner. If you're getting offered $35,000 for your carbon rights, well, is that good or bad? Well, let's take a look at the average in your region. And every property is a little bit different, so there is uniqueness there. But at least we can give you some relative figures to compare and contrast your offer with. Now, those companies that you're going to get these offers from, if you're interested, you got Forest Carbon Works, and I'm going to go into detail on each of these and kind of our experience with these programs as we move through the slides. Right now, we'll just kind of touch base on some of the major ones for landowners with less than 5,000 acres. If you've got more than that, please give me a call. And there are way more opportunities for larger landowners, larger 5,000 plus, a little bit different once you get to that scale. As Tristan said, Family Forest Carbon Program's another one. I won't go into too much detail on that since you already got a good overview. I'll kind of talk more about Forest Carbon Works and these other two guys. Natural Capital Exchange, also known as NCX, and then a company called Working Trees that is almost brand new. I think it's of this year. That's that Working Pasture carbon crediting company. And everything that I'm talking about, you can reach out to me and I can get you some more details if you're interested. So we'll talk about Forest Carbon Works first. This is a company that operates in both the compliance markets, like Charles stated, as well as the voluntary markets, like he also brought up. They've got two different programs for different marketplaces. With that being said, you've got a 100-year contract, or I should say 125-year contract. What that means is you have a 25-year crediting period where your property is generating these carbon credits. Going back to Charles's slide, I'm not going to go through that whole system since we've already touched on that. So I'll talk about the program specifically. You have a 25-year crediting period where you're getting payments every 6 years. The payments get adjusted, so you get annual payments adjusted every 6 years to take into account the growth of your forest as well as the fluctuation in carbon credit pricing. Okay, and then at the end of your crediting period, there's what's called this 100-year monitoring period, where Forest Carbon Works and their representatives may come to the property and take some additional measurements over time to kind of track the change in stocking as time goes on. They do an assessment via a forester visit. You have a minimum of 40 wooded acres to be in this program. Average payments, you're looking about $10 to $20 per acre per year. And their recently released voluntary carbon program basically mimics the compliance market of California, but takes the state of California out of the contract. So if you were to sign with, for example, their compliance program, you, the landowner, are in agreement with Forest Carbon Works, this developer, as well as the state of California. So the voluntary carbon program that they've recently released takes the California aspect out of it. They still maintain similar standards to the compliance market, but they're not in the California Air Resources Board compliance market. So it still has that 100-year and 25-year contract terms because those are what is required in the compliance markets, but they run it through a voluntary system, which removes that California aspect of the landowners out. One of their points is because that they're able to mimic the compliance market standards and specifications, they claim they're able to offer you a more competitive price because they have more high quality credits. That's from Forest Carbon Works. And of course, full disclosure, we do receive small monetary bonuses for enrolling landowners in Forest Carbon Works. I'm not trying to pull a blanket over anyone. I'll let you know how we're involved in some of these programs, give you an idea. So I pulled some numbers off their website, forestcarbonworks.org. This is their impact as of recently. And they're going on, I believe, 2 years now. So since 2020, don't quote me on that. But this is the numbers here: amount of landowners, the acres, payments, and then the metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is a nationwide program, very popular on the West Coast and the Northeast, and I've seen a lot of work in the Upper Great Lakes. In Ohio, we get some landowners interested in Forest Carbon Works. The big stumbling block for a lot of landowners with this program at first was the fact that you were in agreement with the state of California as well as Forest Carbon Works. You know, if Forest Carbon Works, for instance, were to go under, you were still liable under your contract with the state of California. So this new voluntary program that they've launched, you know, they've removed California out of that agreement. You know, it provides a little bit more acceptance for a lot of landowners not being involved with a government entity, especially if, you know, any of these private companies, you know, they're all private companies. It's not government mandated purchasing unless you're a California manufacturer. But you get some of these in Ohio, Forest Carbon Works. I don't see a whole lot of these. The 125-year contract term scares a lot of folks away. And most of the landowners that I see interested in this program are those that have several hundred acres, so larger landowner sizes, and they've got like estate plans or legacy plans for their property that they know the property is going to be passed down to certain heirs. It's been passed on for generations, and that's the stereotypical type of landowner I see most interested in Forest Carbon Works. Again, every landowner and every property is different. Just because you don't fit that mold doesn't mean Forest Carbon Works might not be a good fit. It may. And then I won't go into too much detail on this because Tristan already did it. Oh, nope. Go back. There we go. So I've got a lot of numbers for Family Forest Carbon Program from doing lots of property visits in West Virginia, Pennsylvania. You're looking at, on average, about $100 to $230 per acre for the 20-year term. So $10 to $23 per acre, or you know, about $10 to $12 per acre per year on average for Family Forest Carbon Program on their properties in PA and West Virginia. That's the data that I have. You're looking at, from a forester's perspective, any foresters out there, this program generally equates to 6 cents per board foot. If that means anything to you, that's part of that comparison table that I would review with a landowner, you know, talk about what a board foot is, how it's relative, and how the pricing goes. We are associate foresters for them, so we do get paid for doing forester visits. And as Tristan said, they're expanding to Ohio by, you know, sometime in 2023. By far, out of all of the ones mentioned at the beginning, NCX, Forest Carbon Works, Family Forest Carbon Program, this is by far the most popular from my base of clients. Come on. There we go. So here is, again, this is more nationwide data that's pulled from their website. They're looking at 35,000 acres enrolled. There's their metric tons CO2, and then they've got a car emissions offset figure in there. But that kind of gives you an idea of the scale that they're operating at. They're not available nationwide like Forest Carbon Works is, as Tristan already explained where they're operating. So keep that in mind if you're going to go back and compare some of these numbers. All right, natural capital exchange. These are the 1-year term, folks. Okay, so that gets a lot of landowners interested. When you look at Forest Carbon Works at 125, Family Forest Carbon Program at 20, here you've got a company saying, oh, 1-year terms. So let's learn about it. So instead of having a forester come to the property like Forest Carbon Works or Family Forest Carbon Program does, their assessment is done entirely remotely via satellite imagery. There's no acre minimum. I've seen landowners with 5 acres enrolled. So what sets this apart from some of these others is natural capital exchange. All your ownership must be enrolled. So say Anthony Pappas, myself, it'd be great if I had this. Say I had 1,000 acres. 500 was woods, 500 was field. Well, if I were to enroll in Family Forest Carbon Program, you know, obviously I'm just enrolling the wooded acres. That wooded acres is bound to the terms of the contract. Well, in NCX, you have to enroll all your acreage, regardless if it's enrolled or not. So there's no partial enrollment. So going back to my scenario of 1,000 acres, I'd have the 500 woods, 500 field get enrolled. And here's some information that we'll go over, but basically a landowner gets paid to defer their harvest for 1 year. So a landowner gets paid what are called harvest deferral credits, and they're changing some of their bid processes right now. And there's a lot going on with NCX as we speak that I'd be happy to discuss more in depth with someone, not part of this presentation. I don't want to take up all the time going through some technical program stuff here, but they've revised their landowner bid process. They've currently postponed some enrollments, and Charles talked about these registries being basically a stamp of quality assurance, you could say. Well, Vera, which is one of these bodies, which is one of the most popular bodies, has not approved of NCX's methodology. So the way that NCX calculates these things, it didn't say that they, turned it down per se, but they're not moving forward. You can see the quote there, not moving forward with the way that they do their accounting at this time. They may look into it in the future. There's a link there if you'd like to see, if you want to get more technical about what Vera said. And you can also view NCX's response right there as well. Want to make sure you saw both sides of it. So NCX is right now in the process of potentially developing an independent registry certification type board. But again, I'm not going to go through too many details on those technicalities. Unless you'd like to, we could do it, at another time. But we do also receive a small monetary bonus for landowner enrollment through NCX. But that's all done remotely via satellite imagery. Forester doesn't even have to show up to the property. And with NCX, the way that their bids used to be calculated is if you had 100 acres, let's say, and they said that you had, I'll just use easy numbers, don't quote me on these, 50 deferral credits. Well, if you decide I want to do a timber harvest and I want to remove 30,000 board foot of timber, then we would just remove that value of credits from your sale. So if you were assigned 50 and you want to do a harvest, remove some of this volume, well, maybe we only sell 30 credits. And there's some formulas on, right there what a credit is to board foot of hardwoods. So we're able to calculate that. So that does offer you some flexibility on a property, especially if you're interested in moving forward with a timber harvest. And I was able to actually get Ohio specific numbers for NCX, which was nice. So they recently, started having Ohio contracts in about 11 months ago. They've got 24 accepted applications, 38% with the Forester. Almost all are private individual, which we would assume. There's their total acreage, about 5,200, and a credit value of about 40 grand in landowner payments. And that is specifically their Ohio properties. Their website down there, ncx.com, that could provide you, if you want some nationwide numbers to kind of compare with all of them, you'll be able to find it there. They have a pretty good website. And then you have this new program called Working Trees. This is not really comparable to these three previous ones. The three previous ones are what's called improved forest management projects. This is a afforestation reforestation project. It's recently released. I thought it'd be a good opportunity to bring this up because it does still involve forests, just maybe not like we think of forests. So it's silvopasture. What that is a working pasture with managed timber interlaced throughout the pasture, both to improve livestock quality, health, and soil sustainability, timber management, eventual economic returns on timber, and a lot more. I won't go into too much detail on this because I don't have any experience working with them yet because of how recent this program's been launched. But I wanted to include it here to give you an idea that there's some other, outside the box thinking involved in this space. Basically, a landowner can get paid to grow trees in a pasture land. If you look down at the bottom, you can see they break it down to a purchase rate of $30 per ton of CO2. The acres number, don't quote me on this, but I think it comes about $50 an acre a year, something like that. Like I said, this is a brand new program, so I'm not well versed in it yet, but I wanted to put it out there, let you know that it's there. If any of you guys have run livestock or interested in learning more about silvopasture, their website, workingtrees.com, is an excellent resource. They've got some videos up there that explains this more in depth. This is more of a talk for, not, I'm a forester, I know my limits. So this is more of livestock, ranching producer type expertise. But I wanted to bring it up here. If you got questions on it, I can get you in touch with people in that program. So after reviewing some of these, you're wondering, well, some of those sound pretty good. What's the catch? There's always going to be a catch. Well, the contract for the carbon follows the property. So just like your mineral rights, basically, if I'm a landowner, I signed up, I won't quote any of the one programs. Let's say I sign up for a 50-year contract, and 30 years from now, I decide to sell the property. Well, that carbon contract is going to follow that property, regardless if I own it or not. That means I've already been paid, theoretically 30 years for these carbon rights. That new landowner, he's going to be purchasing this property. That timber is essentially useless to him. You've already got most of the payments. That new landowner's tied up in what they can or cannot do with the timber based on the program that you signed up for. So it's very important when you're looking at one of these carbon programs to think about what your long-term ownership strategy is. Catch two. This is big right now, and this is for Vera, which is one of these certification bodies. If you do it enroll in, let's say, carbon program A, let's say it's 10 years. 10 years go by, you're out of the program, everything went hunky-dory, you're good. Another 5 years go by, so it's been 15 years now, and you decide, I want to go try this new program, program B. Well, because your property was already accounted for in a previous carbon program, that property will be ineligible to enroll into any other carbon programs, okay? So that's very important. What I'm saying is if you enroll into one program, that property, whether you own it or not, they don't care, is no longer allowed to be accounted for in any future carbon project. Now, that's not a government regulation that's saying that. That is one of these registries that Charles was talking about, regulation that's saying that. They expect it to change, but they recently declined changing this in this most recent year. And I'm not advising landowners that it will change until it's actually approved and I've got it in writing. So again, another very important concept to take into account when discussing these carbon programs. So like I said, some things to consider before going into a program. And these are things as a forester that I'm discussing with the landowner while we're out there. We're talking about your tree health. I'll touch base on that in a second. I don't want to repeat myself, but first thing you got to think about your ownership strategy. Is a 1-year program right for you? 20-year, 125-year? Working trees, I believe, is a 30-year commitment. This is important, vitally important. Okay, I'm a forester, and as a forester, I have an ethic responsibility to provide you with our recommendations to improve the long-term health and sustainability of the forest resource on your property. So if I'm out doing a property visit for a landowner and you've got an overmature, overdense forest, you've got health issues, or whatever the case may be, that we might recommend some sort of thinning or harvest or other method that might not align with these carbon program requirements, we might advise you against enrolling in a carbon program until we've tackled some of these management options first. Because it's very important to realize that we need to still be managing our forest. Carbon is one way of managing it. But if your property is in need of, let's say, a commercial harvest for being overmatured, too dense, and maybe slowly killing itself, some of those harvests, might not be compatible with some of the regulations in the carbon program. So when we receive an offer and we discuss it with the landowner, we're looking at, some volume numbers, your board foot per acre, and seeing, talking about basal area, which is a metric of tree density on a property, actually being on the property. A lot of those things will tell us some management recommendations that might be, could be beneficial to manage your property for long-term forest health and sustainability. So we're not just signing up landowners to sign up landowners. We're taking into account the whole forest as a resource and how best to manage it wisely and effectively. Something else to be asking yourself is, what does the carbon credit research tell you? It's a relatively new market. Should we enter it now or wait? A lot of these things we move with a landowner through if they were to get an assessment and recommend, Heritage Habitat, or they call us and want to get one of these assessments. It works both ways. You could call the project developer, say you want to use us as your forester, or vice versa. You can call us, say you're interested in program A or B, and we can kind of run you through the gambit. It's kind of like I just said, next step, if you're interested, you'll need an assessment. Some are done remotely, like NCX. Working Trees has an assessment that's done, I believe, entirely by the landowner on their website. Let's go to their website that was mentioned earlier. All the assessments are free. Okay, so we're not charging the landowner. Carbon company's not charging the landowner to do these assessments. And we can, like I mentioned, we could facilitate these assessments, discuss more about which might be a better fit for you. You'll receive a quote for your carbon. Some things that get shared is obviously they're going to know parcel data, location, phone number, mailing address. To get an assessment, that's generally the information that's needed. They're all no obligation. Just because you're getting an assessment doesn't mean that you're tied into anything or obligates you to do this or that. Here's a lot of stuff put on the website. I just wanted to show that it was out there. You could visit my website later if you'd like. But we talk about the different programs, what carbon credits are, what are some of the different companies that we kind of already touched on in this webinar here. And then at the bottom there, further resources. I've got several articles that are helpful to landowners interested in carbon programs that are put on by other sources other than me. There's some of my information, website. Important to visit the carbon company's websites too. That way you can kind of hear their side of things. And then there's email and phone number. And that's all I got, Dave.
Great, thank you. We had lots of questions, I think 11 or 12 that popped through, and most have been answered. It looks like we have one more question, and I believe that one is for you, Anthony, so you might want to check that. And it looks like he's answering that question. So with that, I want to thank everybody. If we have other questions, we have time for a few. If anybody's not comfortable using the Q&A, if you'll raise your hand, I'll keep an eye out for that, and we'll try to take a question or two. Any more thoughts out there from the panelists? I'd be glad to take some closing thoughts from you folks before we call it a program.
Yeah, I've got one thing that I failed to mention. Right now in Ohio and West Virginia, if you enroll in one of these carbon programs, you're still eligible for any property tax law programs that you may be in. In Ohio, think of CAUV or Ohio Forest Tax Law. In West Virginia, you've got Managed Timberland Program and the Stewardship Program. Right now, it's all good. That could change, of course, once government gets their hands on anything. There could be some new regulations coming out, but a lot of it is on a case-by-case basis, for instance. But right now, there's no contradiction between a landowner being enrolled, let's say in Ohio, in CAUV or Ohio Forest Tax Law, and a carbon program. Just important to have a forester out on the property so that we can learn more about the forest health and the management of the forest as a whole, and not be so, let's say, prioritizing carbon at the detriment of forest health. So that's always something that we need to keep in touch with as well, being a forester.
There's also one more in the Q&A for you, Anthony. What's the minimum acreage for Anthony to drive halfway across the state to provide a free assessment? So do you have a minimum acreage?
So that's good that you asked that, because that kind of ties in with some of those disclaimers I make. Some of these assessments, for example, Family Forest Carbon Program, pay us for the visits. That way, there's no money out of pocket for the landowner, and the landowner gets a visit from a forester at the same time. That's one of the benefits of that program that I've heard from countless landowners compared to some of the others, is that program provides for the free forester visits since the company's paying the forester to come out. So in terms of Family Forest Carbon Program, there's no requirement or no minimum for us to do an assessment. In terms of NCX, those are all done remotely. If you wanted to have since the carbon company calculates carbon remotely, we'll do our assessment remotely. If you did want us to come out in person, that would obviously have to be a charged fee. And Forest Carbon Works, we recently quit doing property visits for them, although they will send out a different forester, and then we could still review the data and the analysis based on that other forester's inventory work. But Family Forest Carbon Program right now is the only one that will actually pay us enough to justify us driving to go do a property visit for land. But a lot of times, a lot of landowners that we're doing these assessments for end up, potentially enrolling into Ohio Forest Tax Law or CAUV or in West Virginia Managed Timberland Program. So, we're able to tie multiple services to one visit, which, is a win-win for everybody. But if anyone's got specific questions on those things and kind of, where we go, just give me a call or email. We do, like I said, statewide in West Virginia and Pennsylvania.
Anthony, would you mind going ahead and typing your webpage and contact in the, I missed it. I want to make sure it's right. So I'll let you type it in the chat. And then just a reminder to everybody that I did just stick the webpage for Southeast Ohio Woods up. And I don't know exactly when, but within the next week, we should have the recordings posted and any resources that my speakers want to provide.